Hey, it's Jeff Hyman, your startup therapist, where we focus on the people part of startups. And I'm joined today from Colorado by Dave Mayer. Hey, Dave.
How are you?
It's great to talk with you.
Yeah,
Thanks for
thanks for
being on
having
the
me.
podcast. You are the founder and the CEO of Technical Integrity, which is such a cool name for a recruiting company that
Thank you.
focuses on engineers, right? I mean, that's just a great name.
I appreciate it. Yeah, it really came from my father was a captain in the Air Force, and he told me growing up that the only thing you really own in your life is your integrity, and so that was a big part of
I like that.
of where it came from.
I like that. So one of the things that your firm focuses on, Dave, is recruiting technical teams to early stage companies.
Right.
And so for the next 15, 20 minutes or so, I'd really want to drill into that because I got to tell you, finding engineers, especially software developers, is potentially one of the most frustrating types of people that we need to recruit because they're just
Right.
so hard to find and
Right.
very hard to assess and hard to
Right.
interview, right?
Yep.
So why don't we start with the biggest mistakes that you see people make when they are trying to recruit teams of engineers and software developers? Where do we go wrong?
I feel like a lot of the time organizations are looking at their watches and thinking that they only have a really short period of time to get their message across, and it's me, 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 and it's not truly being authentic in the process about understanding the needs of the individual involved, understanding that there's lives involved and wives involved, and especially in Colorado, we actively try to recruit folks to come work here, and thankfully it's not too hard. But we are very authentic in our process and honest and brutally honest, I like to say, and in really just engaging with folks and understanding what's important to them. And it's really literally the first question out of my mouth is, what's important to you, and help me understand what makes you tick. And then we can potentially talk about what might be an interesting match.
So aside from money, what other things do you hear in general from software
Sure.
developers and
Yep.
and engineers are important
Yep.
to them?
So money is actually last on the list.
Wow.
It is a technical challenge.
Hmm.
It is they want to feel engaged and interested in the subject matter. It doesn't necessarily matter the silo or the industry, but it does matter that they're going to be excited to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and write down a cool idea that they just thought of, and not be dreading getting out of bed in the morning.
Right.
And so helping them understand the technical challenges and problems they will be facing is usually a number one. Certainly the team itself is absolutely imperative. They need to understand what is the nature of the team, what is the management style of the folks involved, how large is the organization. One that we're hearing more and more is how much can you work from home.
Hmm.
Flexible workforce is really critical these days. Um, in Colorado specifically, it's also work-life balance.
Right.
If it's a powder day, are you going to let me go ski, or are you going to be a jerk and tell me I have to sit in my seat?
You mentioned the team, so let me help me understand that because as I've recruited and led development teams, it's interesting in that many developers want to work with very smart
Right,
engineers and developers that they can learn from.
right,
On the other hand, it's been my observation that some developers, not all, have healthy egos and they want to be the best and brightest on that team.
sure,
So how do you reconcile that as you're interviewing and recruiting developers? How do
sure.
you find that right balance of it's a smart team, but you will be able to rise to the challenge?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's important to note that everybody's got an ego, right? It just exists, and so understanding the dynamics of each person's ego, what is important to them. Um, I think more and more we find that um, individuals want to contribute in some meaningful way. Um, if it's truly a competition to get to the top, and they have a massive ego that's not likely going to play nicely in the sandbox, then we're talking to the wrong individual.
Sure, sure.
And that comes to light pretty quickly. again, usually sort of this brutal honesty thing that I pride myself on and our organization on is just, hey, look, we're not here to pull any punches. We understand how important this is to your career, and not to mention how important this is to a team that we're hiring for.
Right.
Let's just cut the bullshit and let's talk.
But how do you? So all that sounds good, and I'm sure it's
Yep.
dead on, Dave. But
Yep.
how do you interview for that? How do I know
Sure.
when I'm interviewing a developer, setting aside their technical abilities, their technical chops, which we'll get to
Yep.
in a minute? How do I assess whether they're a prima donna, whether they're going to be difficult to work with, whether they're so introverted that we're going to have to lock them in a room and slide, sliced meat under the door to feed them?
Right.
How do you get at that?
Yep. Well, and a lot of it is, I mean, that's ultimately what 15 years of experience comes with, right? Is that's our expertise, is to get to that quickly. But it's a fair question. It's I feel like seeding the conversation with that upfront that, hey, this is how we operate. We're not going to tell you what you want to hear. We're not going to sugarcoat anything. We're here to have an honest conversation. That's usually, the beginning for us, because then they can relax a little bit. They let their guard down.
Mm-hmm.
We're here to help you find the best match for you and your family. And then, then they're not hopefully spewing a bunch of crap. I think if somebody really needs to hear themselves talk and they're just going on and on and on and on and without any regard for the conversation flow.
Right. No emotional intelligence.
Correct.
Right.
That's exactly right. No emotional intelligence is a critical thing to get to pretty quickly.
So no matter, I just want to be clear about this point.
Mm-hmm.
No matter how smart this individual is,
Mm-hmm.
they could be the most genius software architect in the world.
Right.
Your experience is that we should not hire them unless they have sufficient EQ, emotional intelligence, to play nicely with the team. Or are there exceptions? Are there times where, you hire that individual that's just a little bit odd because they can get the job done?
In my world, working with small and fast-paced startups, the answer is 99% no, not an option. If we were hiring for contractors, sure. If we were hiring for a remote role, maybe.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. They work at home. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So they're not continually, in the fishbowl with somebody bumping in and just being awkward and not knowing when to shut up.
Yeah.
But the majority of the time, our clients are actively trying to build a culture, continuing to build a culture, whether aspirational or otherwise. And these individuals need to be able to play nicely in the sandbox. And so if the ego is too big, or it's a massive competition to get to the top straight out of the gate, it's a non-starter.
Let's talk about interviewing for the other component, which is the technical chops, their actual skill set. I see the resume. It's got every language known to man listed on it. Everything sounds great.
Yep.
Especially for the non-technical hiring manager. Let's say I'm starting a company and I'm hiring one of my first developers. My background is business. How do I interview and assess that person's technical chops?
Sure. And I think it's sort of, again, going back to the top of understanding really what's important to them, because even though they may or may not have all of these technical skills, that may no longer be important to them. And so if you haven't gotten to the bottom of that and they want to be a leader and they don't want to have anything to do with having their hands in the code, then you're barking up the wrong tree.
Right.
To answer your question, a lot of this comes from the directives of the clients that we're sitting down with, we're going in to meet with, to understand their culture, to chat with the various developers, to literally get a gut feel for who they are and how they operate on a daily basis. And so, when we're doing Google Hangouts discussions, it's a face-to-face, or we're in person over coffee or beers, a lot of it is a judgment call. I think a powerful thing that you can do is certainly ask for a GitHub profile. Mm-hmm. You can see how active they are contributing to open source.
So is it safe to say that's now a basic expectation, Dave?
I would say yes, especially in Boulder and Denver. It is, they want to see the quality of the code, number one. And number two, they want to see, most of our clients want to see that they care about the open source community and that they actively contribute in some way.
That's interesting.
So,
So that's gone from an interesting differentiator
right,
of a
to a
candidate
fundamental.
to almost
Yep.
a must-have.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
What else?
And that's for A players. They're obviously not. We're not asked to work too much on junior and mid-level stuff.
Right.
It's largely senior engineers.
Yep.
But and so the expectation, of course, is less for those more junior folks.
When it comes to assessing technical skills,
Yep.
some startups have put in place kind of a test drive or
That's right.
a homework assignment.
Yep.
To have a candidate, at least a finalist candidate, do. What have you learned about that? Does it work? And if so, what is the best practice for using that?
It's a great question and an important one. We have seen it both be really effective and be really ineffective, because sometimes it's written in-house by somebody who has a lot of other things to do, and sometimes it's using an existing tool base, and those are effective, but perhaps the internal team has not taken the test, and so that's not an accurate representation.
Right. If you don't benchmark the rest of the team.
Exactly. And so I think it works. We have gone through a number of iterations of this where we think we're clear on what the client expectations are. They have created the test, which presumes that there's a benchmark in place, and then the individual takes the test, and they either time out or they're just confused about specifically what's being asked, and sometimes it's not necessarily a fair test because they were not given enough context.
Right.
Because
right.
Sometimes fellow engineers aren't necessarily the best communicators, and so making sure that all expectations are clear up front, that there is a benchmark, and that again, there's also, if it's clear that you need to be done in an hour or 30 minutes.
So you like the idea of a homework assignment or a test drive only if it's done right.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's fair. I think it has become also a standard that it's either an online test or something that has been created in-house. Create a solution. The big part that I have become a little nervous about is when it ends up taking half the night for an engineer to work on, and I feel like that's bordering on uncool and unnecessary, and just not an accurate representation, and sort of unfair, especially if they have 10 other interviews.
Sure. Let me ask you about finding these rare candidates in the first place.
Sure.
Let's say that we're looking for a software developer. Maybe we can't afford a recruiting firm, and so we're looking on our own.
Yep.
Something I've heard recently, and tell me if this has been your experience, is that these developers are being so besieged by job inquiries that they're pulling out of LinkedIn and they're getting out of these social networks. They just can't stand it anymore.
Yep.
Is that happening? And if so, how do we find Rockstar developers from a sourcing perspective?
Sure. The best answer I have for you is community building. That is really what we have built our reputation on. Is I worked for the Fortune 100, recruiting for them for the first half of my career, and realized that they were doing it incorrectly, and it was all about butts in seats and no regard for culture fit, and we're probably going to offshore this in 6 months anyway. So and so I said BS. There's got to be another way. And so I created Technical Integrity in 2010 with this give first ethos. I don't know if you're familiar with Brad Feld. I believe you are.
Yeah, he's been on the podcast before.
Yep, and so he's been a mentor to us. In 2008, 2009, sitting in the back of the room at the Boulder Denver New Tech meetup, which was 400 people, standing room only. He was preaching about building community and giving first, and having zero expectation of anything in return. While yes, it's a long play, it's the right play. And so what we've done, and the way we've been able to engender trust in the community, and which results in referrals and sort of ongoing business, both from engineers and from our clients, is sponsoring and organizing community events, Boulder Startup Week, Denver Startup Week, Ignite, and Boulder Beta, and the list goes on. But being actively engaged in your community and giving first and giving back. And then when you are sponsoring the big data meetup, or you are actively, you are speaking again without saying, "Hey, here's my jobs," and then walk out of the room after you drop the pizza off, which is a bullshit approach.
Right.
You really need to genuinely care about the community, and whether maybe it's not the CEO because he or she doesn't have time.
Right. Maybe the CTO.
Maybe it's the CTO,
right.
Which obviously makes more sense, engaging the engineers specifically.
Right.
But it's also holding events at your facility. It's taking active part in these startup weeks that I think they're up over 100 this year.
Yep.
And the regular events that happen and need to happen.
That is a key part of the responsibility now for a CTO, isn't it?
That's right.
Is getting involved in building that engagement to do recruiting.
Yep.
But a lot of CTOs aren't wired that way. Maybe they're a bit introverted, or maybe they just love the technology.
Right.
But
they have a staff that is going to be, and they need, and if it's not, they need to find the right staff who can be a community evangelist, and somebody who can attend the Ruby meetup or the Java meetup, and regularly say, "Hey, we're still hiring, but we're being super picky, and here's why."
Right. In the few minutes we have remaining, Dave, I'd love to talk about career paths for developers from the perspective of me, the CEO of the business. So I've done what you've said. I've got engaged in the community. I've interviewed right. I've assessed their technical chops. We've built a great engineering team. Over time, people want to get promoted. They want to move to different challenges. Obviously, not every developer was born to be a manager. What have you learned in terms of best practices of how I can retain my developers when every headhunter in town is calling them every day? But at the same time, I got a business to run, right? We've got to get some things done. We can't just create career paths for people. How do we do that in the context of a smaller company?
Super important question, not an easy one. My best answer is open door policy, continued engagement, over communication, truly letting your folks know that you care and that you're not just in it for the paycheck, and that you genuinely care about their well-being, their continued growth personally and professionally. If you're engaging with them at least quarterly, and letting them know that you want to hear their concerns, their ideas, that they feel like they're being heard. It's just genuine, authentic communication, being transparent about your concerns in the process, not withholding information that they need to know about. Obviously, they don't need to be privy to everything, but it is important that you have an open relationship, and it's not just a top-down, do what I say or get out mentality. That's a surefire way to lose your team.
Many developers want to be actually involved in not just the technology, but they want to understand the business side as well. They want to understand that customers are using the amazing stuff they've built. They find it very rewarding. I've often insisted upon bringing developers to our sales meetings, and people would say, "Why are you doing that?"
Right.
And first of all, the sales reps love it because they can thank the people that are building this product. Second of all, the developers love it because they see the sales team and customers getting excited.
Right. They see the full process. That's right. And that's something we hear a lot is, I don't want to be involved in too much maintenance. Some is okay. And I want to be involved in the end-to-end solution, not just do my part and hand it off to the next team. While that's not always possible, I feel like that is something that engineering managers need to hear.
Right. One last question, and then we'll wrap up. It's been my experience with regard to startups that many developers and engineering teams kind of travel together. They like to work together repeatedly, 2, 3, 4, 10 folks. I'm interested in the pros and cons of that, because it would strike me that is a great thing. They speak the same language. They can finish each other's questions. Right. They like the same pizza. On the other hand, are you getting the newest and latest and greatest thinking? Are you cross-pollinating ideas?
Right.
What are the pros and cons? Or maybe another way to ask the question is, when is that appropriate versus not appropriate? Hiring kind of a whole team.
Sure. My sense is that that's much more appropriate for larger organizations, probably much more mature startups, if not even sort of, moving into the, $100 million companies, where that does make sense and they can live in their own silo and they can be effective. In our world, in the, sort of average of 50 to 200 person team, it's probably not going to make sense to bring over 10 new people intact as a team, because I can pretty much guarantee you that half of them are not going to be a culture fit for the organization overall, and that's going to create a cancer within the organization, even though they may be effective as a team.
You really got to look at it person by person and not just assume this whole team is a plug and play. It's going to fit great.
The other way I could see that being effective is in a really early stage startup, where some of these folks have worked together and maybe it's a team of 5. The company is imploding, or the writing's on the wall, or they don't have the autonomy that they want or need. And you, because you're active in the community, they come to you and say, hey, what's going on? And you can say, well, actually, I've got some pretty exciting stuff. And how would you guys feel about coming over as a team?
How large a team should we think about? If it's more than X people, should we be concerned?
I mean, I think 5 is a great number. 10 is, it's rare that you're going to be able to port one company culture to another.
Right.
And again, finding, the last thing you want to do is put a square peg in a round hole from a culture standpoint. And, while they may be great engineers, they may ultimately not last very long if they don't belong in your organization. And so in that case, it makes much more sense to build your own team from scratch.
Great. Dave, this is so helpful. Thank you for sharing your insights about recruiting engineers, developers. How can people get in touch with you or learn more about technical integrity?
Sure. Folks can email me at dave@technicalintegrity.com. And obviously our website is technicalintegrity.com. We have a Give First a video series that we did in conjunction with Techstars. And we'd appreciate any comments and thoughts.
Great. Thank you, Dave. We appreciate your time.
Thanks.